Compliance management. In this nugget, we take a look at compliance management. We start off by taking a look at auditing. This is where we want to make sure that we can identify anytime something has been changed or someone's attempted to modify something, for example. We also take a look here at the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, which is a really good little tool. It's not very big, not very big in terms of megabytes, but it really gives you a lot of pretty good information that you can use. You can run it remotely, but it runs better if you just run it locally. Also, we'll take a look here briefly at WSUS reports. Remember, we talked about WSUS in a previous nugget. Here we'll also see that it can give you pretty cool reports that gives you a wealth of information about what's going on with your systems. There's also the SCCM baseline, which you can use to identify whether or not your systems are in compliance as well, and you can configure your own baseline and your own criteria there. And then we take a look here at the Security Configuration Wizard as well. And this is pretty much the way that we then implement security. All of these are mostly taking a look at the security and what's going on, and then to implement it and apply the iron fist of security, we use the Security Configuration Wizard. Alright, now we've talked about auditing at some point in the past. I think it's somewhere around the 9th video through this series, and we talked about auditing and audit poll and some different things you can do there to set the directory services auditing to a very specific and granular level. Here I just want to quickly revisit auditing because it is part of the compliance management that you might want to keep in mind. And specifically, what you want to do with this is to enable auditing is you'll do it through a group policy object, and I'll show you that just briefly here as a quick review where that's going to be done. Remember, when we do this, we're going to go to, for example, on default domain controllers policy, which is where I am right now. If I want to audit some kind of an Active Directory item here, I can go to the security settings under here, local policies, audit policy, and then we have a number of different items here. Specifically, if I wanted to audit, for example, the directory service access, I could define these policy settings for success and or failure, and I would want to see anytime someone accessed Active Directory objects. And what this would really do is just identify anytime somebody accessed the object, successfully or unsuccessfully. And for most part, it's probably going to be successful because even generic users do have read access to most Active Directory objects, especially anything that they could be searching against, such as individual user accounts. You might want to search against the user account to see who their supervisor is, or what their phone extension is, something like that. So all of that is available. But you would just go ahead and audit that as necessary. And then the other thing you would do is you would also want to create a SACL on the object. And of course, a SACL is a System Access Control List item, and we don't really need to do that particularly with Active Directory objects, but if it was file auditing, for example, then you would audit that file. You would go to that file or that folder, you'd go to its advanced properties, and you would configure auditing there as well. And again, we have addressed some of that in the past. And then you would configure your event log to match. Remember, if you're going to do a lot of auditing, you might wind up with a lot more information than you bargained for, and so you might need to increase the size of your event logs just to hold all of the data, because sometimes in reality there's quite a lot of data there, and in fact there's so much data you might need to filter the results, and the filtering is really good in Windows Server 2003 now, so that if you go down to diagnostics and event viewer and you just look at some log, let's just go to system event log, as we take a look at this, there could be something in here that we want to know more information about. So maybe event ID 7036, whatever that would be. I could filter that current log and look only for event IDs 70-7036, I think I said, didn't I? Okay, and so there's a lot of different criteria here for filtering against that, because otherwise there's a lot to comb through, and it might be very difficult to see the forest for the trees, so to speak, because really there's for most of these there's really too much information, kind of like when my uncle used to talk about his bunions. Way too much information there. Okay, so we want to be able to filter that as necessary, and then you can also clear the filter in order to be able to see events of other types here as well. Now, one of the ways to also identify the security environment that you have and to identify whether or not you have any glaring holes in your security is to use Microsoft's Baseline Security Analyzer. What this is it's going to identify a baseline, and really that baseline is simply Microsoft's best practices for security. Now, you might not want to be wrangled into what Microsoft says is the best practices, but the truth is they're really pretty good ideas. Most of their best practices. You might vary them a little bit for your own requirements, but usually they work pretty well. Other thing with the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer is that it can check up against WSUS. So if you have a WSUS server and it's approved, 75 updates, then you can run MBSA, which is what this is, Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer. You can run that up against the WSUS updates and see how many updates that client has received. This may be easier in some respects because the reports that Microsoft provides for you in WSUS are, again, also sometimes almost too much information and a little bit difficult to comb through at times, although they are very good reports. It can also identify if there are any clients out there that are not pointing to any WSUS server, so maybe they're kind of orphaned. That might be very useful to know because you might not realize that you have certain clients out there that are never getting updates, and that would be very important. Also, this is an interactive tool. You'll kind of next finish your way through it, and it's not something that will run every night at 2 o'clock in the morning, or so it's not scheduled or anything like that. It doesn't create any kind of automatic reports for you while you're not sitting at your computer and then email them to you or send you notifications or anything like that. So you probably would want more elaborate products for this, but after all, the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer is a free download from Microsoft. It's also very small. It's only like, I don't know, a couple megabytes if that. So it's a pretty good tool. Now, Microsoft's official documentation says that the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer 2.1, which is the version that I downloaded, is not compatible with Windows Server 2008, but I think it actually is. In fact, I've run it, so I'm going to click on Start where I've already installed this program, and we'll see it appear right here under the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer. I find that it's kind of ironic that Microsoft doesn't know its own application, so it says, ooh, do I want to trust this program or not? Well, we'll choose Allow, of course, in this case, and then we can scan a single computer or scan multiple computers. Now, this could have some very far-reaching capabilities for you because you might say, hey, there's a whole department over there on a specific subnet, for example, and I don't know if any of them are secure. So I could scan those multiple computers or scan a single computer. It doesn't matter either way. Now, one thing that's also interesting about this is that I can identify it by computer name, but another thing that I could do is to identify it by IP address. In my particular case, I'm going to scan a remote system, so I think I've got one online over there. So that's Vista Client 01 is up and running. I also do, by the way, have some deliberately weakened security settings so that we have something to show, so that you can see some of the remediation that it provides and all of that sort of stuff. Here are the things that it's going to check for: weak passwords, vulnerabilities, IIS vulnerabilities, SQL vulnerabilities, all those sorts of things. Some of those, of course, don't apply to a workstation like this that we're scanning. But then we can also configure computers for Microsoft Update and scanning prerequisites. Wow, well, that's a whole awful lot of words, but what does that really mean? What that's going to do is it's going to allow the MBSA to automatically install or update the Windows Update agent on the client. And this client piece is important to make sure that it does get the proper updates in the future. But you can select or deselect that, and you can also choose Advanced Update Services options. You can, again, compare it against a WSUS server, okay, that's been applied to it, or you can scan using Microsoft Update only. So a couple of different ways of going there. I'll just choose the latter option there. Alright, that's pretty good for now. I'm just going to go ahead now and choose to start the scan, and we'll let this do its thing, and when it's finished, we'll resume recording. Alright, and then when the MBSA is complete, we get a report here. Now, I do want to point something out just briefly before I go through some of this. That is that in order for me to be able to scan the computer remotely, 3 things have to be enabled. The server service has to be enabled on Vista Client 01, the remote registry service, and file and printer sharing. Now, that's kind of impractical in some instances because you might not have all of those things enabled for security purposes. So it's kind of ironic that you might have to make your computer insecure in order to remotely scan it. But so this is really, in many cases, this is really probably going to work better as a local scanning tool because, among other things, you don't get things like this either, where it's not able to scan it or contact certain portions of that computer's capabilities. So here we see some, security updates. It wasn't able to contact the Windows Update agent on the target computer. This was due to firewall settings. Again, that's one reason why it would be better sometimes to run this locally if you can. And you might not be able to run this locally on all of your machines because that wouldn't really be practical in the enterprise, but you might need need to do it for a representative sampling or for systems maybe having specific problems with one or two known systems that you want to scan against. Then here we get some automatic update items. This feature is disabled on this computer, so this computer is not going to get any updates. That's something we would have to look into. And we have some accounts here that have non-expiring passwords. Too much detail there. So you could look at which passwords those were, for example, which accounts those were, for example, and that would then identify those specific accounts. So you can see kind of how this works, you know, and it's just pretty good tool overall for doing a quick one-off scan of one or more computers, but again, probably works better as a local tool. Now, there's also a couple of other places you can get reports. For example, you could just use WSUS if you've already got it installed and running somewhere. What this does is it will collect information that the client delivers to the WSUS server. So the client, what it does is it downloads any of the updates that it's been approved to install, then it installs it, and it will then send a report back to the WSUS server. Now, this does have some potential for mild or small inaccuracies. For example, if I have a client that's downloaded an update, installed it, and then sent back to the WSUS server that it was a successful install, but then something else goes wrong with that system later on and we have to re-image it from something like a ghost image or from a complete PC backup or something like that, well, then the restored image might not include that update, and yet WSUS could potentially think that it still has it. So it's just a mild or a small problem, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, you can also send the output to Excel, a PDF, and of course, since the data is being stored in SQL, you can run SQL queries against the data as well, depending on how elaborate you want to go. And then by way of example, I've gone here to a working WSUS server where you can see that we have an update status summary, for example. And with this, we can see any kind of a classification that we would want and so forth. So maybe I don't want to see all the classifications. Maybe I'm really only interested in critical updates. Well, by clicking that link and then deselecting all of these except for critical updates, I can then run the report against that. Also, maybe I'm not interested in all products. I just want to see what's going on with Windows Server 2008. So I could scroll down here and select only that option. Then I wanted to see, any computer, whatever, any kind of a status that I want to run as well. Basically, there's not quite limitless possibilities, but quite a few. And then I can just choose Run Report. Once the report does finish, then it will identify only those reported items that I specified in the previous interface. And in this example, we see now that we have, some kind of a critical update for the .NET framework that has been installed and so forth. So we can see that it's approved for all servers, and everything. And we can see if we have any computers that it's not been installed on or it's not applicable to and so forth. So pretty good information. Don't forget, you also have these arrows up here at the top to take you from one page to the next, which gives you just another wealth of information further along here as you go. So that's just some pretty good information there regarding reports. Now, if you decide to use SCCM, you can develop your own baseline. Unlike the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, which uses Microsoft's best practices, you can kind of custom configure your own, and there's a lot of different options, but here's probably the main ones. One, you can choose which operating system, which required applications you want to be on all of your clients, and because remember, SCCM can deploy applications, so you can identify which ones are required, and then which ones are prohibited. Maybe you have an older version of an application that corrupts data anytime someone tries to edit it with the new version of the application, and that kind of thing does happen. So you might want to prohibit certain applications or certain versions of applications. There's also various updates that you can require as well, just like we have with WSUS, and then various security settings here as well. So you can configure your own baseline with SCCM. Now then finally, there's the Security Configuration Wizard, and this one's more of a heavy hitter. This is not just a reporting item. This is something that you can use to collect information, but moreover, you can use it to configure settings that you then want to apply on a broad basis. So this is going to be, your enforcer. This is going to enforce whatever baseline you decide upon, and it's included with Windows Server 2008, but you can also download it for Windows Server 2003. This is useful for policy prototyping here as well, and what we'll do with that is, what this is where you'll take a representative sampling of that kind of server you're working with. For example, maybe I'm trying to configure security for file servers. Well, I'll go to a file server and I'll run this tool. This does not actually write changes to that server, so you don't have to be concerned about accidentally applying changes you don't really want. What it does is it compiles the settings into an XML file. And then what we can do as well is, if you're pretty well versed with security templates, remember these are INF files that have custom security settings built into them. and that you can modify for your own purposes if you want. It can also add those security templates into the XML data. And then once you've got that data, you use the command line tool scwcmd.exe to create your own group policy object. And what it does is it takes all of the information that we've gathered in these first bullets and it spits it out into a group policy object that is not linked to anything. And that, again, would be something that you would want to then link to an OU that had maybe test computers in it or something, and see if it overly locks down those systems to where you can't do anything anymore, or if it properly applies the security settings that you had in your expectations. So if I wanted to run the Security Configuration Wizard, I just go to Administrative Tools, and there it is, Security Configuration Wizard. This requires administrative access, and I'll just go ahead and click on Next. One thing you do want to keep in mind here as well, though, this little exclamation point item, you do have to make sure that if you have any firewall rules that are run by application, you know what that is? That's where you'll have an application, and when it runs and needs a certain port, the firewall will automatically open up that port. Now, we've used that a couple of times here previously in this same series. Well, you want to make sure that that application is running at the time that you run this particular wizard. Now remember, you run this wizard on a representative sampling. This is going to be what we use for our policy prototyping. Okay, so if I want to come up with, for example, a set of security settings for domain controllers. Well, I'm on a domain controller right now, so that's where I would run this particular item, and I would make sure that any applications this domain controller needed to run at any given time was also running. Also, if there was a service that ran that also had to use certain ports, I would want those services to be running as well. So then what you do is you just go through here and you say, create a new security policy, or some of these other options that you see that kind of explain themselves. And then as we click on Next, we identify the server that we want to run this against. Now, you can do this remotely. You just do have to make sure that you can communicate with that remote server, but I'm just going to run this locally instead for the time being. And I do recommend that you do run this locally so you can avoid any conflicts or other issues that you might have with connectivity to that other remote host. Then what we have here is the fact that it's just communicated with this local computer. Then I can choose View Configuration Database. Now, what does that give you? Initially, it doesn't look like a whole awful lot. And here it is. And when I say, by the way, it doesn't give you a whole awful lot, actually it gives you a lot, but it's really relating to information only. Nothing's actually configured within any of this. But it gives you some information. For example, let's take this first one, Certificate Authority. If I open that up, that'll identify for me, let me expand this out, identify for me, for example, the firewall rules that it would expect to see open. Okay, so that's just the kind of thing that it gives you. It's mostly informational, but you can get quite a lot of information out of it. And then we can take a look at our role-based services. Here's what it's going to identify as installed roles on this computer. And I can add or remove items as it relates to my objective for security for computers of this type. Because remember, my objective here is that I'm really using this for policy prototyping. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and click on Next. And then I'll say certain client features. The first page was server features. This one's going to be client features that I might want to add or remove to my security profile. And then you have various options that might be installed as well. And again, for each one of these, I'll add or remove things by checkbox here, depending upon whether it represents what I'm trying to accomplish with my security goals. And, additional services, same kind of an idea here as well. And then I can specify that I do not want to change the startup modes of any of my services, or if I want to disable any of those services. And this, of course, really relates to any unspecified services. So as we go through this, if there's a service that's discovered that doesn't really directly relate to any of those checkboxed items that we had previously, then we have to tell the wizard what to do with it. Well, don't change the startup mode or disable it if you want it to be, extra safe or something like that. Now, this is just a confirmation page, so we can identify the services that it would change to make them, presumably at least, more secure. And then that's pretty much it for that section. Now, you can also skip certain sections if you're sure you don't really have any concerns about those items. I'm just going to skip a few of these, actually all of these, really, because I just want to show you the output of this tool. So then I'll click on Next, and I'll identify the name of this policy. I'll just call this James Secure, okay, security. All right, something like that. And then I'll just go ahead and save it as that, and I can also enter in a description. If I want to view what the security policy would look like, I would just click that item there, and it would identify any changes being made to various services and so forth. And if I did have security templates, so that would be those INF files I told you about earlier, I can include those here as well, and I would just click on Add, and it would identify, what the domain controller security INF template, for example. I could add that one in. Okay, and I would just open that up, and it would be now part of this security configuration. Now, you probably don't need to do that for any of the default INFs, such as DC Security. That's a default one that appears out of the box with Windows Server 2008. But I probably would do that if I had spent a great deal of time and effort custom configuring our own security templates at some point in the past, and I didn't want to just discard those and throw those away. If that were the case, then I would include those security templates. Now, what I could do now is I could apply the security settings now, but you got to be very careful about that because certain settings, such as file or registry settings, are difficult, if not impossible, to reverse at some point in the future. So you have to just be careful about that. I would choose Apply Later because what it'll do then is create the XML file I told you about, and then I can just apply that once I'm good and sure that that's the actual settings that I want. And you can see there that that's the name of the XML file that it would then create. Alright then, once that's all been done, then I'll go to Group Policy Objects, and we see I've got a bunch of policies there from previous nuggets that I've taught and stuff like that. But I don't see one that says James Security or anything like that. Now take a look at this. I'm going to go to my command prompt, and I'm going to run scwcmd, and then I'm going to do a transform, because what that's going to do is it's going to transform my XML file into whatever I name right here. So this would be, what did I name that file? James Security. .xml, I think it was. And then /G, that's going to identify the group policy object I want this to be called. I'll call this James Security. Okay, and press enter. And once we do that, it's going to take the output of this XML file and put it into a group policy object by that name, and it's going to be an unlinked policy. You look at this and you're saying, James, I don't see any policies there. Well, hold on, Mr. Impatient. I just got to refresh the screen here. Now we have James Security. And all the security settings that we came up with in that wizard and all the checkboxes we had and any security templates we added in would now be here in this unlinked policy. And then all I would have to do is to take this and link it to a specific location. Be very careful about that, because if you have highly secure settings that you drag and drop onto a group of unsuspecting desktop users, you'll probably lock them down so tight they won't even be able to browse the internet. Hey, maybe that's actually a pretty good idea. Maybe we should do that. After all, maybe the best firewall in the world is one where users can't access the internet. Then we'd be in business. Alright, so that's pretty much how we work with the security configuration wizard. In this nugget, we talked about compliance management, which is where we want to identify what's going on in our environment and then make any corrective measures that we need to make. We start off by auditing things to see what's going on. We want to see if someone's successfully or successfully making changes or unsuccessfully making changes, as you might have it. Then there's also the Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer. Well, this is very good, especially as a local tool, to be able to identify security weaknesses in a system, but it's the Microsoft baseline that you're scanning against, not your own criteria particularly. You can scan it for multiple computers, but I find that it works best with single ones, local ones. Then there's also the WSUS reports. Remember, with the WSUS, we have that that we talked about in a previous nugget, but the reports are very good, and you can save the format as an XML file, for example, or a PDF. There's also the SCCM baseline, which is where you create your own baseline instead of using Microsoft's, like we did in the BSA, so you can identify what's going on there. And then, if you want to make any changes, you can use the Security Configuration Wizard to go ahead and determine what security settings you want, and then you can export that all out to a group policy object. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like